someone who knows a lot about patriotism. She's an honorary member of the Tea Party Patriots. And Jenny Beth Martin joins me right now. Jenny Beth, how are you today? Thanks for giving us a few minutes.
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Jenny, I'm just amazed myself personally at how there's such a disparate behavior from different governors. Some governors haven't shut down. Some governors want to reopen. Other governors are talking about 2 months from now. And it seems like, if you're a patriot, you believe in federalism, you want power to be given to the states. So I think Trump's trying to actually manage a good blend of leaving power with the states, but giving, some federal oversight and guidance. And I think some of these real left-wing progressive governors have really got out of hand here. What do you think about this?
I think you're absolutely right. We have governors who have gotten completely out of hand. I'm very thankful that President Trump did not create a one size fits all solution at the beginning of the crisis. And honestly, I'm glad he has not done that at the end, and that he's created guidelines so governors and local governments can figure out what works best for their area, especially based on how the virus is doing in that area. I
So,
am in one of the states, I live in Atlanta, and I'm in one of the states where the governor is beginning to slowly reopen the state. And we did not have such severe lockdowns as some other places in the country. But right now, we have, on average, 540 Americans a minute who are losing their livelihoods. And we have to find a way to balance their livelihoods with the way to protect those who are at the highest risk with coronavirus. And I think that all the governors know they have to do this. It's just a matter of whether they're willing to go ahead and take the steps to begin finding that balance.
yeah, and that's a good number you used. 541 Americans a minute are losing their livelihood. But then you got places like New York where 540, 550 people per day are losing their life. So we have to figure out a way to come up with a delicate balance here where we can cut down on the amount of actual lives are being lost and start increasing the amount of livelihoods that are preserved. And it seems like, it's right down party lines. And at a time when our country, you would think, should be uniting, and standing together shoulder to shoulder with one response, you got governors all over the place going off the reservation. And the left-wing media is trying to blame the president for people protesting in the streets, exercising their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, well, the fact is, in the middle of a crisis, the thing that all elected officials should be doing is leaning on and standing on the Constitution, not abandoning it. And the First Amendment doesn't go away in the middle of a crisis. Those are the times when it's the most important to look to the Constitution so that you're doing everything needed to protect the rights of people while you're addressing the crisis. And when you don't do that, that's when people start to get upset. And I think that's where some of the protests are beginning to happen because people feel that their rights are being infringed. Now, the people who you mentioned who are dying every day in New York, that's why I think it's so important that there is not a one size fits all solution and that we find a balance. I've spoken with doctors in the past couple of days, one in rural North Carolina, whose hospital is facing bankruptcy right now because they don't have any patients because they've stopped the non-essential surgeries or the elective surgeries, and they have hardly any patients. They have furloughs and they have a 20% pay cut across the board for every employee. I heard the same thing from a doctor in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles is supposed to be in California one of the hot spots for the virus, and yet at hospitals, even in California, they don't have enough. They don't have patients. The halls are empty. The emergency rooms are empty. And while the people who are in New York are seeing the worst of the crisis, and when we're not seeing it, we've got to make sure we respect those people who are living through the worst of it. people in the other parts of the country are not getting the medical care they need. They can no longer see their doctors. Suicide rates, domestic violence, these kind of calls to 911 are going up around the country. And there are other real world health impacts that are happening because of the lockdowns. And some of the lockdowns are very extreme.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't add up in my head. I'm 52 years old. None of us have ever seen anything like this before. That's for sure. But I'm thinking that, you see, New York's like 50% of the country's totals.
Right.
So of course we have to have a little bit of a different strategy here. We're the most densely populated metropolitan area in the country with 7 million people in a 20-mile radius. So obviously, but I'm thinking, like you said, I've had on clinical psychologists, I've had social workers on, and they're saying that the collateral damage from this is, people that were in recovery, people that had substance abuse issues, they're more inclined now to see all of those things go up. There have been, I think it is an 80% increase to calls to suicide hotlines. Those people that were right on the edge, the one thing they had every day was going to the office and talking to that one friend and going outside and sitting in the park. Now they're just locked up in their house with all their problems, which are getting worse every day. I know we don't, people like us, we don't want to see the federal government exerting too much power, but should the president maybe use his powers to put some uniform guidelines that, hey, you can do what you want, but it's got to be within this?
I think that would be helpful. There are guidelines that are out right now that he unveiled last week. I think that there may be some room to adjust the guidelines. And throughout this entire process, guidelines and recommendations have changed. We saw that happen even with masks, which literally are on your face. So if we can adjust the guidelines regarding something that's literally in your face, we can look at seeing maybe some of the other guidelines might need to be adjusted. I'd like to go back to one thing. You're right. None of us in our lifetimes have ever seen anything like what's happening here today. I've read over the last few months several books about what happened during 1918. And some of the lockdowns and even some of the language that is being used today is very, very similar to what happened in 1918. And one thing I've said to people who are very worried that the rights are going away and we're never going to get them back. Now, they won't come back if we don't stand up and make sure that we demand that they do, that we have our rights restored and treated the way that they should be. But we went from extreme maybe not quite so nationally lockdowns, but lockdowns in certain places of the country during 1918 to the kind of freedom that we experienced 2 months ago. And I know that we're going to get back to the same kind of freedom that we had 2 months ago. It's just a matter of exactly when. And in places like New York, where people literally live on top of one another in buildings, there are going to be different things that have to be done in an area like that than in an area where you may live in a subdivision and you have a third to a half an acre between every single house. It makes logical sense just when you look at the two areas. The guidelines are not going to be the same because the way that people live their lives simply is not the same.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm, a armchair prognosticator, but I'm thinking we're seeing overwhelmingly that there are specific targeted types of people demographically, geographically, that are more susceptible to this. The elderly, people with pre-existing conditions. Unfortunately, it seems like minority communities are getting hit harder than middle-class communities. That's mostly because most of those minority communities are governed by progressives and liberals who basically lie to their people every 4 years and then do nothing to improve their health care situation. But, maybe the government can come out and say, hey, everyone over 70, you're still quarantined for another month. And everyone with these pre-existing conditions documented, you're also quarantined for another month. You people that have been tested and have come out of it, you can go back to work. And then maybe somewhere in there, the governors can have a dial where they can say, you know, that doesn't work for me because I'm more dense, and you know, there's some plus minus on it. But I think there's ways where we can get people back to work uniformly.
I think that what you just said makes a lot of sense. But the people who are the highest risk stay in, and the people who are not go back and help open up our country. And I'm not in a category that would be considered high risk. So one thing that I did at the very beginning of this, and I think that as we reopen, we have to remember this. I reached out to the people in my neighborhood to find out if anyone was at high risk or had high risk people in their homes who might need help with errands or grocery runs. And I think that as we reopen, we have to remember and continue to look out for those people who are at high risk. If they're staying home and self-quarantining so that they don't run the risk of getting sick and don't run the risk of overloading the hospitals, then we need to make sure we're doing what we can to help them out. And I think that we will. The one thing that gives me the most confidence of anything is that I know in this country we're the most entrepreneurial, innovative, compassionate, and charitable people on the face of this planet. And because of that, we will find ways to open up and balance social distancing while also looking at the people who are at high risk or who have lost their livelihoods and making sure that we voluntarily reach out and help them out. That's what Americans do. And I know that's how we're going to survive this.
All right. Well, Jenny Beth, thank you very much for joining us. It's Jenny Beth Martin. She is honorary founder of Tea Party Patriots Action. And we need all the patriotism we can get right now, Jenny Beth. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You're the best. Thank you.